Ludmilla turned around as Momen left and the gate closed in on itself. Upon doing so, she found Amelia reaching above the dining table towards the oil lamp hanging from above.
"Please excuse me, Lady Shiltier," her maid apologized for the imposition. "This lamp needs to be refilled." Facing back away, Ludmilla worked off the neutral expression she had frozen onto her face as the two members of the royal court conversed with one another. As she had not been called upon to speak, she could only remain silent without a reason to interrupt their discourse. She felt a presence at her arm and looked down to see that Lady Shiltier had come out to stand beside her. "You went from hot to cold quite quickly there," she said as they looked out the manor window. "I believe most of the women around D. Rantle would have flung themselves bodily at Momen if they sensed even the hint of a proposition from him." "I had no expectations at all," Ludmilla replied, "so I was caught completely by surprise. My mind has been on everything else but, recently. I think it's been that way for all of my friends as well. Too much has changed, there's just so much to do, and never enough time. Even if there was, the pool of suitable consorts is sparse." "It's not as if the land is completely bereft of men." Lady Shiltier looked up at her. "Being in your position, you should have plenty of options." "If it were only that simple. Leanne and Florine might be more open to certain matches, but Clara and I are far more selective. I guess it boils down to our respective religions. I hope you don't mind my bringing it up, as you are a cleric yourself, my lady." "You are speaking of human religions, yes? I'm a bit curious, actually." "In that case." Ludmilla paused for a moment, thinking on how to best explain. "The faith of the 6 great gods once dominated these northern lands, but, at some point in the past, a heresy took root, a schism, if you will, and the faith of the 4 rose to prominence, supplanting the tenets and much of the culture promoted by the faith of the 6. The great cathedrals that were founded long ago alongside the cities became quiet, and only a few strongholds remain, such as Wardensvale and the territories that now form Corlin County. There were many differences that caused this schism, but, by and large, the central tenets of the faith of the 4 are far more convenient for the northern nations, if I were to describe it. Their paths are not as straight and narrow as ours, and how each faith views family and marriage is an example of that." "I see," Lady Shiltier said. "So the humans that are picky are followers of your faith, and the ones I see rubbing themselves all over one another on the city streets belong to the others." "That's a bit too general of a statement, I think." Ludmilla frowned at the mental image. "But if you observe Clara and I alongside Leanne and Florine, the difference in behavior is distinct enough that it doesn't need to be stated directly. For lack of a better term, Clara and I are more reserved. The faith of the 6 encourages its followers to evaluate potential partners based on their strength and ability with the hope that our children and their descendants will, too, become stronger with each generation through this practice. The institution of marriage is sacred, and faithful relationships are not only prized, they are expected." "Ah, that explains why you started to bristle after you recovered from Momen's words." "I bristled." Ludmilla didn't think she did. "I didn't mean to openly, but I did feel that way inside. As a follower of the 6, those are the values I was raised with. In the northern nations, where the faith of the 4 holds sway over the vast majority, our tenets that harness the truths of the world have been cast aside and forgotten. Partners are often chosen using frivolous criteria, bloodlines are thin to the point where they might as well not exist at all, and the potential of entire generations is left to the winds of fate. All sorts of wrong-headed ideas manifest, such as one's worth being judged on the basis of inherited wealth and social status, which only serves to make the problem even worse." "Then," Lady Shiltier asked, "as a noble, you do not believe yourself above your fellow humans?" "As a noble," Ludmilla answered, "I understand that I have the education and training invested in me to do what I am supposed to be doing, just as a professional in any other vocation. I do not believe in any inherent sense of superiority conferred simply by occupying my station. The expectations and trust placed in me are components of duty, not privilege. Also, as my house has remained faithful, I understand that my lineage is more reliable when it comes to producing individuals of higher caliber. It is simply a fact proven in every generation that members of our house are martially superior compared to the average individual. House Corlin is the same. They consistently produce excellent administrators every generation, and are in a position to harness that potential. Both Clara and I are a product of the tenets of the 6 great gods,
born and raised to excel at what our bloodlines demonstrate aptitude in. We do not run around with the idea in our heads that we are wholly self-made. By the same token, we tend to respect others for what they are born into, be they a farmer, smith or merchant. I didn't realize there was so much behind your reaction. Lady Shaltir lightly scratched her cheek with a finger. I suppose Momen should resign himself to his fate. Not only are both Momen and Nobbe strong, Ludmilla said, they have such a close history together. I guess the very idea of his infidelity was offensive. Besides, since they are like that, he should be the same as Nobbe, yes? A small sound issued from Lady Shaltir's nose. She struggled to control herself for a moment before giving up and laughing outright. My lady. This is too much. Lady Shaltir said as the light chime of her laughter filled the manor. Of all the things that could, cheating on Nobbe. Bah-ha-ha. A few minutes went by before Lady Shaltir finally reined in her mirth. She wrapped her hand around Ludmilla's elbow, drawing her close. Silence. The sounds of Amelia working deeper inside ceased once her liege cast the spell. She felt a cool touch as Lady Shaltir reached around to hold her other hand, pulling Ludmilla lightly to face her. You're not angry? Lady Shaltir asked. What about, my lady? Through your perception, Lady Shaltir told her, you have discerned that Momen is the same as Nobbe. That the hero of Irantal is not who the people believe he is, a champion of humanity, the legend that lifts their spirits as subjects of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Does that not bother you? I knew that Nobbe wasn't human when I first met her, Ludmilla said. It didn't change my recognition of her as an adamantite adventurer. Adventurers are not solely human anyways. When we first met, Momen asked me what I saw. His reaction to my answer told me that, at the least, he knew as well. After learning bits and pieces of Darkness Tale from the Adventurer Guild, I guess I naturally came to that conclusion. That he isn't what others might expect does not change the fact that he willingly took on a burden that was not his own, and continues to shoulder that burden to this day. I know you to be an even-handed individual, Lady Shaltir noted, with a perspective far more broad than most of your kind. Do you really think other humans would share the same sentiments? Ludmilla withdrew her hands from Lady Shaltir's light grip, turning back to look out past the river to the distant north. Though it would not be prudent to announce it at this point, I do not believe the majority would care all that much. Non-humans are becoming more and more commonplace in the Sorceress Kingdom and, sooner or later, it will just probably be received as nothing more than an odd bit of news. Many are coming to the realization that the future of our people is bright in the Sorceress Kingdom, and it was Momen who was there to lift them up and help stir them to action. He is still the hero of Irantal and, in a way, he is still also a champion of humanity. So that's how you see things, Lady Shaltir said. Well, since you already seem to be keeping it to yourself, I don't believe I have to tell you to keep your lips sealed on this matter. Yes, my lady, Ludmilla nodded. Momen suggested that I do the same when we first arrived in Irantal. It is not really my place to say anything anyways. It's good that you're so accommodating, Lady Shaltir said as the sounds from the rear of the manor resumed, on some things, at least. If you plan on being so selective, what will you do about a consort? We're continuing from there? If it comes down to it, I can always consult with the cathedral. Are you saying that your temples are also matchmaking agencies? It should be expected, considering everything that I've mentioned. The temples keep track of lineages and such and, in certain scenarios, there are allowances for polygamy. Didn't you just say that faithful relationships are expected? Lady Shaltir raised an eyebrow. I did, but the faith of the Six is not simply made out of lofty ideals. Unexpected things can happen, war, raids, famine or disease that decimate populations. If anything, it's the faith of the Four that never mind. I guess that makes sense. So what happens after you apply for polygamy? Do several men just appear at your door one day? In the back of the manor, Amelia suddenly froze. That's probably not how it works, Ludmilla replied. Anyways, I have time aplenty to see to that end of things later. We should get back to the Frost Dragons, yes? Of course, Lady Shaltir said with a slight smile before they made their way back to the table. As they seated themselves again, Amelia came forward and exchanged glances with Ludmilla. Will you be having dinner with us, my lady? Ludmilla asked. This should take us until tonight sometime. Did you need me to leave?
You may stay if you wish, of course. I was more concerned about the council meeting that usually happens around this time. Ah, that. His Majesty is currently in the city during the grand opening of the capital, so most of the evening functions revolve around entertaining dignitaries from the Empire. Should you not be there as a member of the Royal Council and as the Minister of Transportation? A displeased expression appeared on Lady Sheltier's face. The venues have all been arranged by Albedo, she said in dubious tones, so I suspect that she's planned something along the lines of dumping me into the midst of a swarm of imperial nobles to distract them while she looks down from beside the high seat smugly. Rather than needing to politely suffer their attentions, I would much rather be here, seeing to my newly assigned duties. Should I do well, I will have more meaningful audiences with His Majesty in the future. I can't imagine I do well in that sort of setting either, Ludmilla said. I would much rather do as you've chosen. I'm not sure if our food would suit you. Is there anything you can't take? I don't require food, but I wouldn't mind trying a little of what you're having. Amelia lowered her head before turning around to begin her preparations. Ludmilla sifted through the papers on the table, looking for the page where they had left off. Should we continue under the assumption that the equipment will be available? She asked. Yes, let's, Lady Sheltier answered. I can't imagine it being any less than the basic set that he agreed was appropriate. We should put together our projections based on this equipment. If there are substantial changes, we'll be able to see how much the overall picture would change as a result. It seemed reasonable enough. If the alterations had too pronounced of an effect on their projections, they would have a base to argue from in favor of meeting their requirements for equipment and securing the means to do so. Ludmilla had no idea how expensive one set of these magic items would be. However, each seemed to eliminate an aspect of maintenance in transportation, so the practical value of each was readily apparent even to her. Finally finding the half-filled page that she was looking for, she picked up her pen and looked up to Lady Sheltier. All right, the last part we left off was arrangements in Nirantal. Please continue with your notes, my lady. Rather than continuing right away, Lady Sheltier stood from her seat and moved over to sit on the chair to Ludmilla's left. She placed her notepad on the table. There are diagrams and such, she explained, so it will be easier this way. Looking down at the pad of paper, Ludmilla could still not puzzle out anything about the language the notes were written in. The frost dragons are being put up along the northeastern wall of the central district, overlooking the new demi-human quarter. They naturally cool the area with their presence, so the places below the wall will be cooler as well. How much cooler is it going to become? The top of the wall where they live is completely frozen over and a thin mist often rolls off of the walls. They've just moved in, so I don't know how cold it might eventually get. Won't that be a problem? Ludmilla asked. Lord Mayor manages the weather around the agricultural areas of the duchy, so Nirantal is almost always sunny with the harvest on its way. This is the effect of making the areas of the central district along the north wall feel like standing in an oven, so the cooling from the frost dragons should be welcome, at least during the day. The other side, however, is perpetually in the shadow of the wall, so they won't have the sun warming them up to counteract the cold. Yes, that was one of the reasons behind placing them there, Lady Sheltier answered. In addition to providing cooling for the central district, the cold, damp area along the wall on the demi-human side will be used to accommodate the races that prefer cool temperatures, while the opposite wall of the quarter will have the reverse arrangement. It sounds like the new demi-human quarter will look completely different from what it was before. I thought they would just be building homes for the various races coming to live in Nirantal that human homes aren't suited for. It no longer resembles any part of Nirantal, Lady Sheltier told her. The first phase of construction is mostly complete. Mayor is quite proud of the design. The dwarves and Quagua are assisting in the finer adjustments now. Yuri set up her orphanage there too. It's a lot bigger than anyone expected it would be. Miss Alpha founded her orphanage in the demi-human quarter? Aren't most of the orphans she's taking in human children from around the duchy? Most of them are, yes, Lady Sheltier said. Lord Ines has granted her his full support for the project, so she chose a place in the city with a lot of room to build. Yuri also believes that having the orphanage there will result in the children becoming used to seeing and interacting with non-human species, and vice versa. She and a few others have put quite a lot of thought into it. The complex is very expansive. I should really take a look at the new quarter when I have the chance, Ludmilla said. It must be full of ideas that I've never considered before. I'm sure you'll have plenty of opportunities to do so. Lady Shiltia flipped to the next page. We'll be dropping by at some point soon so I can show you around the dragon area anyways. This is what it looks like, roughly. Looking down to the notepad, Ludmilla saw a diagram of the wall. While the curtain walls of Erantal were massive by human standards, they were too narrow to accommodate the frost dragons, which currently measured up to 18 meters in length. In an earlier portion of Lady Shiltia's notes, their slain leader was estimated to be 20 meters from the tip of his tail to the end of his snout. Their wingspan was as wide as they were long, though it was only a consideration for spaces where they were expected to take off and fly through. Dragons reportedly grew throughout their lives, so the hoardings that had been built for them on the wall would become too small for their occupants eventually. Are these hoardings not cramped? Ludmilla asked as she copied the diagrams. For a human these would seem quite large, but the dragons barely fit. They're almost like pens for livestock. It's the best that the dwarven architects could devise given the smaller size of the inner wall, Lady Shiltir answered. Once we've determined where the highest areas of demand for the network will be, the dragons will have their lairs redistributed to match, then we can knock down some of the divisions between the pens in the city for more space. The arrangement is temporary for now and I've let them know that it is, but they certainly like to complain to one another about it when I'm not around. What does a whining dragon even sound like? You'll inevitably hear it one of these days, as much as they do. As long as it doesn't affect their work, they can complain all they want. They've directly witnessed what happened to their patriarch and one of the stronger ones in the younger generation that challenged Lord Irons, so the price of disobedience has been burned into their minds. Would you actually kill one? MMH, not unless they did something absolutely unforgivable. Since their recollection of their own experiences is so excellent, they are easy to train and correct if they pick up undesirable behaviors. They also aren't like adventurers that will be certain to take resurrections after an incident, either. A frost dragon might decide to reject a resurrection out of spite and then will be short one until new offspring can be raised. It would take over a century to replace a lost adult frost dragon. If that's the case, Ludmilla said, shouldn't treating them well be the best course of action? That way there's a lower risk of rejection should resurrection be required. Yes, well, figuring out what treating them well is the question, isn't it? Lady Shiltia told her, you might know what humans desire and perhaps draw some similarities between humans and demi-humans, but these are dragons. Their minds operate much differently than yours. Even the way they perceive the world is entirely alien to you. You will have to understand them first before thinking about how to manage them. In the meanwhile, fear is a more reliable motivator than respect or loyalty. Ludmilla glanced to the side where the piles of translated notes continued to accumulate. She thought the subject quite interesting, but it would probably still take weeks of study to develop what she might consider a basic understanding. At least out in her domain, her daily tasks were grouped by location so she would have blocks of time to read in between. The quiet sounds of work from the nearby counter stopped, and Amelia appeared carrying the first portion of dinner. Ludmilla put down her pen to clear away space for their meal. It seems like we're making good time, Ludmilla said. Shall we take a quick break for dinner? Amelia appeared with a second bowl, followed by tea. Dinner was the customary village stew which Ludmilla had taught her maid how to make. A roll of bread accompanied each bowl, and a rich aroma wafted up to tempt the appetite. She waited as Lady Shiltia studied the dish in front of her. I hope it's to your liking, Ludmilla said. I remembered you eating a biscuit the first night, and you can drink tea but, as you might imagine, we don't have any experience in serving meals for the undead. Our cooks were in the midst of experimenting with recipes that night, Lady Shiltia told her, so I ended up being a sort of test subject. You were as well, as I recall. I think most of them were a failure. There were no unexpected findings, and they confirmed that you simply can't substitute one thing for another in a recipe, regardless of similarities. It did seem like Miss Alpha was expecting something when she asked me how I felt about the meal, Ludmilla said. I guess I should have tried to figure out a way to provide you with something suitable. Are the tales true that vampires drink blood? Blood has a wide variety of flavors and sensations just like any other sort of food, but, broadly speaking, it is what we normally consume. Other undead have different diets. Ghouls eat flesh, zombies eat, actually,
I haven't seen Yuri eat anything beyond human-style food. Miss Alpha is a zombie?
Ludmilla stared at Lady Schultier.
Yuri is a Dullahan, Lady Schultier replied. She's using mundane means to conceal any hints of it, so your talent isn't of any use with her. She looks exactly the way she looks, there isn't much to hide, really. The Iranthal orphanage is being run by the undead. Clara said she would be leaving the 4 children from Fassett County at the orphanage. Ludmilla wondered how they would feel about this. Anyways, you shouldn't worry so much, Lady Schultier said as she stirred the bowl with her wooden spoon. Though our tastes might differ in various things, we can still eat. Eat Todaki moss. Lady Schultier put a spoonful of the village stew into her mouth, rolling it around for a while before swallowing to speak again. This is more substantial than it looks. What the nobles seem to eat in the city is meager by comparison. Is this why you're taller than the other noble women? Clara is only a bit shorter than I am, Ludmilla said, and she dines on the same cuisine as the city nobles. It should be more along the lines of what I mentioned earlier concerning the cultivation of bloodlines. You said something at the end just now that I didn't quite get. What does it mean? The spoon returned to its bowl, idly stirring as Lady Schultier furrowed her brow. After a handful of seconds, she turned to Ludmilla with a questioning look. What did I say? Itada something. It's a ritual of sorts. Lady Schultier turned back to her bowl. If I were to paraphrase it, it's a consideration for all the elements that went into the meal, from what was grown and raised, to the efforts of all those involved in its preparation. By ritual, you mean it's one of your faith? I hope I'm not being rude by prying. Not at all. The saying is a part of the culture of where I'm from. It's simply a respectful mannerism, there's nothing directly magical about it. Lady Schultier resumed eating and Ludmilla began on her own meal, relieved that her liege found nothing offensive about it. They continued in silence until she wiped up the remaining bits of stew with her last piece of bread. Do frost dragons eat a lot? She asked as Amelia carried away their dishes. By their own explanation, Lady Schultier replied, it depends on how active they are. An adult would require roughly 1 large game animal every 4 or 5 days if they flew around making deliveries like I plan on having them. That would require a tremendous hunting range for 18 dragons. Is the territory you've designated as their feeding grounds sufficient? The Azalisia Mountains and its surrounding foothills extend all the way north to the sea, but if the bulk of the deliveries are in the area of the Iranthal, it limits their hunting grounds to the southern parts of the Great Forest of Tob. They'll still have the rings of sustenance, so they won't starve. I just wanted them to continue eating so they would eventually grow to increase their carrying capacity. Still, having that many dragons feeding in the area might have some undesirable side effects. I'm not actually certain what is in that part of the Great Forest of Tob, but if there are citizens living there, it may result in some ill will. I see. Lady Schultier looked up thoughtfully at her. You always seem to have this broad consideration for things. Understanding relationships in nature is a part of being a ranger, Ludmilla said, and, with a little bit of thought, that understanding may provide perspective on other aspects of the world around me, though I can't say it always results in a sensible or useful outcome. So what would be your solution to this problem? You mentioned that they would eventually be based in different locations depending on route demand, so the problem may actually take care of itself. At the least, it would require fewer adjustments once we have a clearer picture of how this network will be laid out. Reaching out to where their work had been piled off to the side, she found the place where they had left off. Lady Schultier took the notepad and flipped through until they reached the page past the diagrams for Iranthal. In addition, she produced a map from the hole in the air, along with several measuring instruments. I've been wondering, what exactly happens when you reach into that hole in the air? I'm pulling things out from my personal inventory. Probably the easiest way to understand it is equating it to reaching into a much larger infinite haversack. I've never seen an infinite haversack before. Today is the first time I've even heard of it. Oh. Lady Schultier reached into her inventory again. Where is it? No, not that one. Here it is. A modestly sized satchel appeared, and Lady Schultier placed it on the table. Considering that the notes mentioned one such container could hold 500 kilograms, it was much smaller than what Ludmilla had expected. Didn't you say that placing an infinite haversack inside another such container would have unfortunate results? An inventory is not the same, Lady Sheltier replied. What I was referring to were other similar enchanted containers like this. After looking towards Lady Sheltier, who nodded, Ludmilla reached out to lift the bag. It was far heavier than it looked, but the weight was only a small fraction of its full capacity. Placing it back on the table, she reached into the dark void of the container. Is there anything inside of this one? She asked as she felt around inside of it blindly. That was the one that was holding most of the paper, Lady Sheltier said. There should be a few other things as well. Try thinking of the clipboard that you saw one of my vampire brides holding in the alley when we met. Ludmilla recalled the item from her memory, and she felt an object in her hand. She pulled it out. It was a clipboard similar to the one that she had envisioned. The item was wider than the neck of the container, but she was able to withdraw it smoothly somehow and deposit it again the same way. What if one doesn't know what's inside? You could always pour everything out, Lady Sheltier said as she returned the container to her inventory. I'd advise caution, as the contents would be unknown. Someone dumping 500 kilograms of objects onto their own feet will probably be in for some pain. You can even store liquids in them, so you may end up with quite a mess. Several ideas that she had been nursing ever since she had read of the infinite haversack floated to the forefront of her mind again. I think I've known you long enough to understand what that look means, Lady Sheltier said. I was just revisiting my thoughts from before about these containers, Ludmilla started slowly as she solidified her thoughts. If a common dwarf can get their hands on something like this, then why is it that we don't see more of them being used? I've become well aware that Reestize is behind when it comes to the utilization of magic and magical items across many fields, but merchant companies who travel the world are not constrained to our local ways of thinking and would certainly take advantage of such wondrous items. You could haul thousands of these containers in a caravan, transporting the wealth of entire cities. Have you considered the idea that nations may see these as dangerous? Lady Sheltier offered. As you say, the implications of such items cast a shadow over your ideas of mundane transport. A nation which collects these would have distinct logistical advantages, be they intended for commercial or military use. It may be that they are simply snapped up by such interests, or the crafters of these items are well guarded and restricted from openly selling their wares. If that is the case, Ludmilla sighed, would Moman even have a chance of locating a source of them? As you've said, the planning of this network hinges greatly on the availability of these items. Without them, our freight capacities are drastically reduced. We'll have to see, won't we? Lady Sheltier smiled. To be honest, my lady, Ludmilla said, I'm surprised that you called Moman here other than someone like the Royal Treasurer for something of this nature. Though the Royal Treasurer seems to be active around D'Rantal, I haven't actually met this person before. The Royal Treasurer has his own set of duties to attend to, Lady Sheltier said. If the situation calls for it, I will personally pay him a visit. I understand, Ludmilla said. Someone in his position is bound to be a busy person, and Darkness should have any number of useful connections with how well-traveled they are. Thinking about the infinite haversacks again, Ludmilla absently stared down at the sheets laid before her. I suppose you'd want one for yourself. I'd want as many as I could purchase, but I have the feeling that these would be far beyond my budget considering their utility. Ludmilla sighed. It seems like anything goes when you have magic. She glowered at the empty space that the infinite haversack formerly occupied. Maybe Liane would know more. Is there some personal use you had in mind for one? Lady Sheltier asked. There's an old problem, Ludmilla said. As members of my family grew stronger in levels, was it? We could use more powerful bows. I suppose that would lead to powerful, enchanted bows, but we never got our hands on any. Anyways, even supposing that we could find a powerful, enchanted bow, we wouldn't be able to realize the full potential of our weapons because taking advantage of the power of such bows meant that we would need to use arrows capable of delivering the incredible force to our targets with power far greater than what a mundane warbow can achieve. What about enchanted arrows? The construction of the arrow still matters. Ludmilla shook her head. If anything, you want durable arrows that won't shatter like regular ones if you plan on using enchantments on them, that way you can recover them after use. Even then, they are only a part of the arsenal that an archer can bring to bear, and this wide variety of ammunition is a part of the problem. There are arrows designed to deliver alchemical compounds and simple mechanisms, those with special material properties to counteract the damage resistance of various species and exploit their weaknesses. A multitude of mundane options exist as well, and all of this adds up. The founder of House Saradnik was said to have been able to knock a troll clean off their feet using the same type of bow and arrows that I use today. They say if he had managed to find a powerful magical bow with arrows to match, he would have been able to take even dragons out of the sky. You're not supposed to be shooting our dragons out of the sky, Lady Shultier frowned. It was just an example. The point is that obtaining a powerful bow is only one part of the problem. Having a selection of arrows that can take full advantage of a powerful bow is not a problem beyond their cost if you are defending a position where you can store them, but their weight becomes an issue if the supply of these arrows is restricted to what you can carry. Without something like an infinite haversack, I need to balance issues of encumbrance and flexibility when I'm out ranging or on patrol. With one, I would be able to bring thousands, well, not that I could afford thousands. At the least, I wouldn't have to worry about storage issues. That in itself would ensure I'd have the bare minimum on hand to deal with any given situation. Well, maybe if you're lucky we'll have some to spare. If Moment secures a supply of them, I will most certainly be taking extras. I wouldn't mind if you wanted one or two for your personal use. Ludmilla remained silent as she deliberated over Lady Shultier's offer. If you refuse me after all this trouble, Lady Shultier said as a frown started to form on Ludmilla's face, I will most certainly get annoyed. I know you're a practical person, and this is about as practical as it gets. If you really must, you may consider this a reward for your continued assistance in managing all this. Yes, my lady, Ludmilla lowered her head. Thank you for your consideration. Let's continue, shall we? Lady Shultier said, unfurling the large map she had taken out earlier. All that remains is examining our routes and making some initial projections for them. The map was centered on the Sorceress Kingdom, but included an extended area around its borders. There were many places without details or labels, but those with them were exceptionally intricate. It was immeasurably superior to the one that Momin showed to her when they first traveled to Erantal. She wondered why that was. Perhaps it was recently made. Who produced this map? Ludmilla asked. The ones that Riastais have are nowhere near as good. That would be Aura, Lady Shultier answered. This is the most recent update of her local surveys. As expected of such a talented ranger, Ludmilla continued to marvel over its craftsmanship. If I were even half as good I would be satisfied. Well, I wouldn't get ahead of myself there. Half as good is probably a lot further than you think. What's this marker here? Ludmilla asked. She pointed to an icon on the map, which was more prominent than even Erantal. It sat roughly 2 hours northeast of the capital by Dragon, situated near the Great Forest of Top. She knew that the maps she possessed up until now were not very good by the Sorceress Kingdom's standards, but something notable there would have surely appeared on them. It is the realm that contains my domain, Lady Shultier replied. It contains your domain? Ludmilla was thoroughly confused. Yes, Lady Shultier nodded. On the surface it covers an area not much larger than a small village, but it is much larger than it looks. Since we're there, let's start with a route from Erantal. Ludmilla added the unlabeled location onto a large table she had drawn up. She had the loose thought that each route should have its costs calculated based on the equivalent land route running between the same two stops, or at least the rates charged for similar conditions by the myriad of merchant lines. Unfortunately, even that was widely varied, as land transportation came in many forms and were owned by villages, merchants and nobles alike. What were ubiquitously known as wagons actually consisted of two major components, a chassis which consisted of the working parts of the vehicle, which could be adjusted to accommodate the bed upon which cargo was loaded. An agricultural village might have a box-like grain bed and a wider hay bed, while villages around quarries, mines or logging areas would have configurations of their own. A merchant's freight wagon, which employed teams of draft animals, could haul roughly 3 times as much as an adult frost dragon equipped with 4 infinite haversacks. There were even heavier freight wagons that hauled massive amounts of ore and stone from their sources, but they were not used in the duchy for fear of ruining the roads. Timber was more often than not dragged by oxen or horses, sized into manageable portions in much the same fashion as Ludmilla's woodcutters sized their timber to be handled by death knights. This made it a headache to price local freight, which was more often than not handled by individual villagers and administrators. In the end,
They decided to leave local freight to local management and focus on hauling cargo over longer distances. At these distances, a specialized, high-speed courier service also started to appear as an attractive option. All in all, it was difficult to determine what the best course would be without actually fielding the Frost Dragons to collect enough information on the actual demand. Maybe we should just match everyone else's rates. Lady Shiltia furrowed her brow as she looked over all the various reference materials scattered across the table. My original purpose was to connect all of the remote and isolated areas of the Sorceress Kingdom, several key locations, and the friendly states nearby. I never considered generating revenues from the service. Well, it goes by weight over distance and the class of freight, which determines factors such as security and speed. With how every shipment quite literally has a dragon guarding it, however, the service is far beyond the high-security couriers used by national interests, and they carry far more than said couriers. Only ships can really compete with Frost Dragons when it comes to raw freight over time, but, as you mentioned some time ago, the capacity for a port to handle cargo will heavily influence the preferred means of delivery. By gate or by dragon or by wagon, full is full, so clients will choose a balance between cost and speed of delivery. Since we're essentially high-speed freight, Lady Shiltia said, what about turning that to our advantage? If you're referring to perishable goods, Ludmilla replied, smaller-scale iterations of the preservation magic that you see used in Erantl's government warehouses are already in use by merchant companies, so we won't be able to compete there. It occurred to Ludmilla she would not have been able to provide that answer if not for her trip to the west, which used Lian's services. The value of wrangling in her cosmopolitan friend to their side was abundantly clear. Maybe they could ask in a roundabout manner until then. Rushing large quantities of cargo might work, she added, but only in the cases where teleportation magic is not available or deemed unnecessary. I can only think that this would happen outside of our borders, as the Sorceress Kingdom appears to have an abundance of casters capable of teleportation. In addition, while this may be lucrative, I can hardly imagine it to be consistent. Ludmilla looked back down to the map again. While trying to match land-based transportation was probably a workable option, it felt like a waste of the advantages conferred by flight. Her bone vultures were ideal for transporting light loads over any sort of terrain, and only the most inclement weather could stop them. Frost Dragons did not care about weather at all, carried more, and were far faster. Her gaze crossed over parts of the map where this advantage could be exploited to its fullest, tracing over mountains, forests and wastelands. There is no direct route between the Sorceress Kingdom and the dwarven cities of the Azalizia Mountains. She finally settled on what seemed to hold the most promise. The mainland route available to us runs out east to the Empire and along their western highways. Since Imperial tolls drive up the cost of transport between us, it seems a clear opportunity for air freight. Also, deliveries between the Empire and Riestais would be promising for similar reasons. Lord Irons has already pledged Soul Eaters to transport goods for the dwarves, Lady Shiltia told her. I'm also fairly certain Riestais wants nothing to do with us for the moment. Soul Eaters. Ludmilla furrowed her brow. Wouldn't the dragons be better, considering what I've said? They would. Lady Shiltia nodded. However, Lord Irons surely knows this as well. Some larger scheme must be in play that we currently cannot comprehend. Ludmilla drummed her fingers on the edge of the table. It seemed that they would be feeling their way through this stage of their planning. Is there a way for us to demonstrate their utility, at least? There may still be some demand from clients in the Dwarf Kingdom for the benefits that only our service can provide. Yes, Lord Irons has seen to that as well. Lady Shiltia nodded. After the event in Erantl is over, we'll be relocating to help the dwarves move back into their old cities as a show of national goodwill. This will also serve as a demonstration of some of the things that the Sorceress Kingdom has to offer. Most of the work should take about a month or so. The dwarves have plenty of first-hand exposure to the value of the service. His Majesty's considerations are certainly well thought out, Ludmilla said. Not only has His Majesty created the opportunity for us to display the capabilities of the Frost Dragon network to the dwarves, but we'll also have a month to gather information, identify problems and refine our systems. As expected of Lord Irons. Lady Shiltia smiled brightly. We must ensure that his precious efforts on our behalf are not put to waste. He must have great expectations for our work. What are His Majesty's expectations? An aerial transportation network, Lady Shiltia said simply. It is our duty to render his will into reality, to the best of our abilities. Ludmilla nodded slowly. It was a broad expectation, but the micromanagement of the various aspects of a kingdom was not the role of a king. For the Minister of Transportation, the missive was as concise as it needed to be. It was now up to Lady Shiltia and those entrusted with these duties to figure out how to make it so. She looked back down to her work, adding other locations to the table. As she cross-referenced the various rates and schedules, tabulating preliminary numbers for their own network, her grasp on things slowly disintegrated. Every route had its own circumstances which factored into their transportation fees, and numbers alone did not really define them. Without the requisite knowledge and expertise, she could not figure out where advantages lay in any but the most obvious situations. As a frontier noble, logistical matters came naturally to her, and it seemed that her sense for it even applied to the aerial transportation network. Matters of commerce, however, she always felt woefully simplistic in. It felt especially pronounced now that she was trying to use what little she knew on the subject on this project. Rather than dwell on her shortfalls, however, she decided to focus on the locations where they probably had the most information on. "What is this body of water marked in Tob Forest?" she asked. "It's an area that was annexed before Erantal," Lady Shiltir answered. "Several demi-human species make the lake their home, and Cocytus rules over them. Human commerce doesn't flow through the Great Forest. Would these demi-humans have some sort of reference for their own workings? As far as I know, they did not trade regularly with the outside world before we found them. They do have rare individuals that have traveled to various parts of the world. Recently, a few have come to Erantal, but the majority remain isolated. What would they be exporting or importing? I thought you might have a better idea, considering how similar your circumstances are to theirs. The surface area of the lake is roughly the same as your floodplains here, though the northern part of the lake is much deeper. Marshes occupy the shallows in the south, and the entire lake is bordered by the forest." Ludmilla could not definitively say what they did and did not have, but she guessed that at least some sort of fish, marsh plants and whatever the inhabitants gleaned from the nearby forest wouldn't be unreasonable. "What sort of industries do they have?" Ludmilla asked. "Mostly hunting and foraging from their surroundings," Lady Shiltir answered. "There are also fish farms which have expanded since they came under us." "Fish farms?" "Yes, something like enclosed portions of the shallows where they tend to fish like livestock." She made a mental note of the curious practice. It seemed like something she might be able to enact in her domain, which could eliminate several future issues at once. "There are no advanced industries. Metalworking? Tanners and tailors? Apothecaries and alchemists?" "The demi-humans there consist of varied tribal groups," Lady Shiltir replied. "They have a scarce number of druids and shamans that tend to their population, and the locally produced equipment is quite shoddy. Coarse garments, tools and equipment made of wood, stone and animal parts. In short, I wouldn't expect anything along the lines of what you would expect to find in a human city. So most of their exports would be fish and these raw materials. If they expanded on what they currently have, while they import manufactured goods, this seems difficult to balance in both directions. The tonnage would be severely skewed to exports. That should be fine for now. The main goal here is still to connect their isolated communities to the rest of the Sorceress Kingdom, giving them the sense that they belong to something greater. It is Lord Ains's will that all races and peoples be united under his banner, that they will be able to live in peace, prosperity and harmony. Connecting the disparate peoples is a step towards realizing Lord Ains's grand vision for his realm. Rather than conquest, unification. That the undead, almost universally reviled, were the ones who sought to bring about this future was an irony Ludmilla could only shake her head over. According to the map, the other demi-human populations living in the wilderness of Tob Forest and the untamed portions of the Crown Lands existed at a near subsistence level and had no interest beyond living their current lifestyles. On the human end of things, every town was already connected to Erantal via highway. Ludmilla scanned over the map of the duchy again, and she noted one more point of interest. "Since when did this Carney village become large enough to qualify as a town?" she asked. "I don't recall any large settlements along the northern edge of the duchy developing in the past few years."
Ludmilla furrowed her brow as she looked down at the oddly large marker along the northern frontier with Tob Forest. It did not match any other settlements in the area, and was even larger than the towns on the highway. Usually, this sort of explosive growth would stem from an economic impetus, such as discovering rare and valuable resources at that location, but word would have definitely spread throughout the duchy if such findings had occurred. A large majority of Carney is now demi-human, Lady Shiltir answered, most of which consists of an army of over 5,000 goblins. I hear more demi-humans come out of the forest to join them regularly. As for when it happened, around the same time as the Battle of Katza Plains this year. How did that happen? Was there an invasion? If I heard correctly, the village was attacked by a detachment from the royal army. A local village girl led a goblin army which routed Riastize's forces, and they've been there ever since. The more she heard, the less things made sense. Why would Riastize attack one of its own villages? How did a local village girl end up with an army of goblins? Ludmilla decided to move on from the subject before they became sidetracked even further. What about the towns along the highways? She asked. What sort of considerations should we be making for them? Since Solitas are readily available here, Lady Shiltir answered, frost dragons should be unnecessary. The highways are serviceable for the time being, and they will see plenty of traffic as things pick up. If they grow substantially in the future, we will revisit the idea to see if there is any merit. Keep in mind that the points marked are along the primary route which frost dragons are used on. Even Carney has suitable land routes for their regular needs, so they will rarely see shipments. The rest of the nation will be included in the network, but minor routes will at best be serviced by bone vultures to deliver small parcels, much like you do here. If all urgent communications and transport in the Sorceress Kingdom is handled through magical means, would it be safe to assume that all major air routes within the Sorceress Kingdom will be for freight while minor routes will be for civilian courier services? It should be, yes, Lady Shiltir nodded. Did you come up with some ideas? Not really. Ludmilla replied, but knowing this makes it easier to determine common rates between the two classes of cargo, at least within our borders. All we have to do is have them match their rates in terms of rough value so we don't put ourselves at odds with the companies that transport the majority of the freight in our nation by land. Do we really need to be stepping so lightly around these companies? Lady Shiltir frowned. We could replace them all eventually with Solitas and such. These small, local transport companies only stick to servicing the duchy, so they should eventually transition to Solitas as the more economical option regardless. Rather than them being competition, they are actually future clients of the administration who will manage the tasks we need done anyways. It saves us the trouble of taking over what they already oversee, and dealing with the minutiae of their specific locales. Her liege continued to frown even after the explanation. Was there something wrong with what I said? Ludmilla asked. No. If the existing services continue to function to a suitable standard, then there should be no issues. If disruptions or disagreements happen between these companies and the Crown, however, Albedo will most likely move to absorb or replace them. Given her tendency towards inflexibility, her domineering personality may simply have such an outcome be an inevitability. Lady Shiltir's statement struck an odd chord amidst their long, yet generally smooth proceedings. Though she had not met the Prime Minister personally, through her work Ludmilla considered Lady Albedo to be a fairly flexible administrator who was willing to slowly acclimate the population of a conquered land to new ways. She did not think Lady Shiltir would lie to her over something like this, but she sensed that there might be a bit of a bias, at least. My lady, I have a question, if you don't mind. Whether I mind or not depends on the question, wouldn't it? Ludmilla thought over her words for a moment before deciding that knowing the answer would help her make better decisions in the future. This extra sense of rivalry that you two have, is it a result of Lady Albedo's personality? The way you make it sound, she seems like quite a difficult person to personally get along with, while you seem reasonable and tempered in my experience. Lady Shiltir's lip twitched. She crossed her arms over the table as she looked sidelong at Ludmilla. I seem reasonable and tempered to you because your traditional duties are somewhat relatable to my own, though the scale is vastly different. This is one of the main reasons why I consider you to be compatible to myself and why things are generally smooth between us. Our perceptions are judged by the same rough measures, and you understand what it means to serve in this capacity. Our duties revolve around being the first line of defense of the realm. Our thoughts and actions are made in deference to this duty, even in tasks outside of this purview. Lady Shiltier's gaze turned away from her, across the table and to some distant place beyond the walls of Ludmilla's manor. There is an irreconcilable chasm that exists between a faithful vassal that stands in her eternal vigil at the edge of the realm, and one who sits comfortably at the right hand of her sovereign. The gates of His Majesty's realm have been breached many times in the past, and it is I who has met every single challenge. I understand that, even if everything functions as expected, sometimes it is simply not enough. I have also seen too often occasions where hastily concocted plans drawn from raw intellect are mercilessly scattered to the wind. Albedo is blessed with a vast intellect alongside her ruthless and calculating nature, but her place is in the highest halls of His Majesty's realm. She sits in the center of an apparatus which spans the length and breadth of the Sorceress Kingdom, where she organizes and plots and plans far above the affairs of her subordinates. She is appointed above all of us, and in her self-assuredness she serves in her capacity, but mark my words, when her schemes begin to fly apart one day you will see what sort of catastrophe occurs as a result. Beneath that smiling face of hers is a merciless demon which looks down disdainfully upon those whom she deems beneath her, and only His Majesty stands above. Ludmilla sipped the tea that Amelia had freshly prepared while digesting what Lady Shiltier shared with her. She wondered if the courts of other nations, too, were like this. Rhea's ties, at the least, manifested similarities with the machinations of the great houses, while Baharuth with its consolidation of power into the imperial administration and its institutions might have inadvertently made things worse for themselves in the long term. As Fassad County had so poignantly demonstrated, the unfeeling gaze of a distant throne could result in many woes. I think I understand why Countess Jesn so feared the judgment of the royal court now, Ludmilla said. Don't get me wrong. Lady Shiltier's gaze returned to her. When everything is operating within expectations and no unwelcome surprises occur, Albedo is an unquestionably supreme administrator. She is also just, within the framework of her own values, anyways, and everything that passes across her desk is subject to the same exacting scrutiny that her capabilities bring to bear. She is still insufferably haughty, though. Then this rivalry that you maintain is not a result of some past incident. Oh, no, Lady Shiltier leaned back and waved her hand dismissively. This was just what I thought you actually wanted to ask. Was I mistaken? Your intuition was correct, thank you, Ludmilla replied. I thought I might gain some insight on Lady Albedo's character, so your answer was exactly what I was trying to ask about. I'm even more curious now, though. What is your rivalry about? All of His Majesty's servants are rivals in the sense that we compete with one another to render the greatest achievements in his service, Lady Shiltier said, so you should keep that in mind even when considering the others. The additional rivalry between Albedo and myself that you perceive has to do with our ongoing competition to see who is most qualified to be Lord Ains's primary wife. Ludmilla took an extra moment to register what had just been said. She was happy for Lady Shiltier, who loved His Majesty so purely, and admittedly a bit jealous as a woman that was behind on that front. The answer made perfect sense, all things considered, but, after being exposed to the grand scope of the Sorceress Kingdom, she felt that it fell conspicuously short of her expectations for some reason. Maybe it was because Lady Shiltier's feelings were already something she had long realized. This is probably a silly question, but how do you plan on getting ahead in this rivalry for His Majesty's affections? Well, it is ultimately Lord Ains's decision, so forcing the matter would be inappropriate. I heard that the gorilla actually pushed him down once, but it only resulted in her confinement. I can only do what I can, and hope for the best, but even if Albedo does temporarily gain his favor, I will never give up. That seems normal enough. Yes, normal, unlike that brute.